Okay, we're back with video 4 for Unit 7 on cities and urban land use, talking about patterns and processes of urbanization. And where we left off was talking about the classical American models of city growth over time. And we need to talk real quickly about John Borchet. John Borchet, one of the big theories in urban geography that's never appeared on the AP exam. So this could be an excellent FRQ item. He talked about how American cities had changed, not so much the shape of them, but the density of cities based on modes of transportation changing. And he started with what he called the sail and wagon era. And this is really kind of late colonial, early independent times of the United States, where cities were coastal all up and down the Atlantic seaboard. He said they only penetrated as far as the fall line, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. After the coming of the iron horse, the train, the locomotive, steam engines, you start to see steam trains and steamboats penetrating into the interior of the Appalachians and in areas like the Ohio River, headed out towards the Mississippi River. And so we see the fill-in after the early 1800s as we start to inhabit states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and headed out to the Mississippi River. Then to get the steel rail era, and this is really from the time of the Transcontinental Railroad onward, where we start to lay rails and tracks all the way across from sea to shining sea. This opens up, with the gold rush in California, with the war with Mexico being behind us and the annexation of all of that territory. Chicago becomes a really major city in the United States during this era of the steel rail. After the coming of World War I and the development of the personal automobile, we get the auto era amenity phase, where you see cars are becoming very important and very affordable for Americans. And we see cities that are kind of automobile driven. And what I mean by that is the design of the city is not so much a walkable city and not so much even a streetcar city or a mass transit city, but a individual sitting in their car kind of a city. And we certainly see that in the Sun Belt as we do the Interstate Highway Act of 1956 going into the 1960s with the suburbanization of the United States. And then finally, he has his high technology era, which takes us up until the present day, where we now are crisscrossing the country at a high rate of speed with airplanes, and also the telecommuting, people that are having meetings, people that are populating documents like Google Docs, where people in satellite offices in 4 or 5 different locations can be editing the same document, storing things in the cloud, video conferencing, talking to each other on their phone. It's instant, it's direct connection. And remember, distance is not really as much of a barrier as it used to be. So this is what I mean by the fall line. We talked about that briefly, where we have water rolling downhill from the Appalachians, right? Because up through Georgia, Tennessee, West Virginia, up into Pennsylvania, this is your Appalachian Ridge. And so the water is flowing downhill towards the Atlantic Ocean. What we mean by the fall line is when seagoing, ships of the colonial era, when they would come up the Savannah River, when they came up the Ashley River in Charleston, they came up the James River in Virginia, they came up the Delaware River to Philadelphia. Once you get to a point, the Potomac River too, once you get to a point where you can't go uphill in your sailing vessel, the water would roll downhill. This would be the cataract or the fall line, where the water falls off of a cliff. And then, of course, the river gets fairly flat as it goes to the ocean. In the Carolinas, they call this the low country as opposed to the high country. And the low country is fairly flat, and you could go up the river in your sailing boat. But once you got to the fall line, you couldn't go any further. So look at all the cities that are along that fall line in the United States. And I challenge you, if you go on Google Earth, you'll actually see the color change on Google Earth. This will be a lighter green. This will be a deeper, darker green as you start to go inland, and you can actually see that fall line on the map. This is what Borchet's epochs or eras look like in terms of, the mode of transportation that I mentioned. And of course, we're living in this era of satellite. Nowadays people are getting their TV from streaming services and their online package express delivery from Amazon, and everything is kind of, electronically done. This is the era that we're living in today, this high technology epoch. But this is something, again, never been on the AP exam. What will cities look like in terms of density? A walking city, right? That era of the horse and the wagon when people were walking in cities, that very, very dense. The streetcar era, a little bit, you follow the lines and the city would start to look like those sector models. Think about the models we just saw earlier in the past slideshow. Burgess is these rings. Hoyt is these sectors that are like pie shapes. Then you start to get multiple nuclei. Once you start to get into the auto era, density becomes moderate. It's mom, dad, 2 kids, and a dog living out in the suburbs. And once you get to the freeway era, you get these exurbs. They're not even suburbs anymore. They're exurbs. They're way, way far away because we can move 60, 70 miles an hour and we can get back to the city to do our jobs and to, take advantage of those urban services that are only being performed where the threshold is high enough in the downtown area, the CBD. So there has been an essay about this as well. What would the pattern of cities look like if it was a rail city or if it was a beltway city? And again, think about these highways that go around and around and around big cities like Atlanta and Washington, D.C. and Dallas and Houston and Phoenix. You start to get this edge city phenomenon, the galactic model. So really, Borchet can almost be hybridized with those other models, the concentric zone, the sector, the multiple nuclei, and the galactic model. This is more based on time period and based on mode of transportation, and especially talking about the density. Once you get to low density, remember we saw in the video Urbanized, the guy in Phoenix was talking about we've always lived at a low density in Phoenix. What he meant was there was never a walkable city. Phoenix really didn't start developing as an urban area until after the auto period of time. The original city of Phoenix is in the late 1860s, and it never became a big urban place until in the early 20th century, the 1900s, is when it started to begin its growth phase. Now, Europe is a lot different. And the most important thing about this slide to know is that European cities are way more dense than American cities are. And certainly that's because of age. European cities, almost all of the big cities of Europe, are 300, 400, 500, 600 years older than the oldest American cities. Remember, the oldest American cities would be places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, the old colonial cities. All right, so those cities in Europe are going to be even older than our oldest, and therefore they're going to be far more dense, far more walkable. They do have a lot of busing and public transit, subways and trains and things like that. In the United States, there is that stigma against, buses and things like that because, those are for poor people. Anybody with money is going to have their own car. But European cities developed really along coal resources because a lot of these cities grew and got very big with the coming of the Industrial Revolution. Remember that 2 cities in Europe are always bigger than all the others, London being number 1, Paris being number 2. They were the biggest cities in Europe 500 years ago. They're the biggest cities in Europe today. They'll probably still be the biggest cities in Europe going into the future. So one other thing we see with European cities is that there is, like in the United States, this strong concentration of ethnic neighborhoods where immigrant communities generally kind of band together. They do that a bit for preservation of identity, a little bit of security in the sense of, they don't want to necessarily mix into the local population. They want to be able to kind of insulate themselves and separate themselves from that dominant culture, which isn't always the most welcoming and friendly to people that are different or that are perceived as being outsiders. So what we can see then is that all across the world, percentages of urban are changing. The countries in the world like Africa and Asia that are less urban are urbanizing. Remember the verb versus the adjective. The places in the Americas and Europe are already urbanized. Therefore, they're not urbanizing much at all anymore. And then also we can see the same thing, not just in the bar graph or the histogram, but also looking at it in terms of a choropleth map where we're setting breakpoints at, generally round numbers. And we can see China, not all that urban, India, even less urban, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, very, very low rates of urbanization. Most of Latin America, fairly high. Certainly most of Europe, very high. Northern Europe being much higher than Southern and Eastern Europe. And then, of course, North America being very, very urbanized as well. So what are some facts and figures? And I'll kind of blow through this slide. I can let you pause it and you can read it as much as you want. But remember that even though India is not very urban at all, it still has millions of urban residents. Because remember, it's a country of over 1 billion people. And you have places like Mumbai that is projected to be the biggest city in the world by 2050, passing up Tokyo. You look at Latin America. Certainly Mexico has a very high urban rate. France is not all that much more urbanized than Mexico is. But you know that France still has a lot of those bucolic, open, rural spaces, the wine vineyards of Bordeaux, the flowers of Provence, where you can find all of the lavender that's being grown, and the perfumeries. We took kids on a spring break trip through southern France, went through the Mediterranean there, the Riviera portion of France, through Nice and into Provence, and then from there on into Barcelona. And it's very rural in southern France. Northern France, of course, tends to be a lot more urban. Certainly, you can see South America, because the interior of the continent is so inhospitable. Remember, your 5-2s, too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, and too rocky. You see a lot of people on the coast, big cities like Lima in Peru, big cities like Sao Paulo in Brazil, Buenos Aires in Argentina, Santiago in Chile. All of those are big cities. In Africa, of course, remember those islands of development where people are leaving smaller cities and rural places and moving to the big, giganormous cities, again, typically along the coast. Lagos in Nigeria, which is one of the fastest growing cities in the world because of continued rural to urban migration. You have Cairo in Egypt, which is a megacity as well. Remember, megacity has to be over 10 million people, and I'll show you that in the slideshow here shortly. Also, the Middle East is very urbanized because, again, you're not really living in the hot, dry desert, so you're living along the coast. Southeast Asia has some very, very big megacities as well. Jakarta in Indonesia, Manila in the Philippines. All of those are great examples of big cities. And then, of course, Japan and South Korea in East Asia. China, very rural still, even though there are big cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and then, of course, Japan with the biggest of them all, with Tokyo, and South Korea with Seoul. So all of those are interesting. But again, when we think about this global spread of urbanization, we really see that the Eurasian urban banana is important to know. You can actually draw a banana from London going out through Central Europe and then out towards Moscow. European cities were oftentimes mercantile cities in the 1600s. The site of the cities did not change. The situation changed because of colonialism, because of imperialism. As the Industrial Revolution came, again, the situation changed, and you saw people flooding into cities looking for work. The modern cities of the 1950s and towards today, again, situation changing. Post-World War II, having to rebuild these cities after the war. Today's advanced postmodern cities, they're not as productive, they're more consumptive. And as we go into the United States, we see a lot of these postmodern cities where we have a lot of brownfields, a lot of Rust Belt phenomenon, a lot of abandoned, derelict landscapes in the big cities like Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, Toledo, Cincinnati has had a lot of this going on where I go read AP exams every summer. These postmodern cities, a lot of entrepreneurs are moving into these brownfield areas and are redeveloping them into, townhouses and condos condos and night spots and restaurants and microbrewery pubs and gastro pubs where young, sexy, hip people are spending lots of money loving life in the downtown area where everything is walkable, mixed use, and this gives us this idea of new urbanism. Really important that you read up on new urbanism. The David Palmer Blue Book does a great job of this. It was one of the lowest scoring essays we've ever seen on the AP exam. I'll show it to you. It scored like 1.26 out of 7. One of the first things about the question was, what are the goals of new urbanism? Again, walkability. We don't want this to be a car city. We want it to be a walkable city, a pedestrian-friendly city. It's healthier. You know your neighbors. It builds a sense of community. All of these nice things. And so new urbanism has been embraced by a lot of cities in the United States to get out of what they perceive as the mistakes of the 60s and the 70s being so car driven and making them friendlier and more walkable and pedestrian oriented places. So that's called new urbanism. And finally, we'll just talk real quick about megacities, and I'll try to finish this up before too long since we're already a little over 15 minutes. Remember the rule about the megacities, they got to be 10 million or more. Today, there are now meta-cities that are now 20 million or more, because really what's happened, we've gone from only 5 cities over 10 million in 1975 to today, where we now have 27, and they're expecting that we could have as many as 30 to 35 mega and meta cities by the mid-century. And remember, a big problem here, a lot of these cities are growing so fast, and they're in Asia and they're in Africa especially, where there's not necessarily a plan for this growth. And as you guys know from the video we watched, when there is no plan for growth and when there's poverty, poor people show up from the rural areas and they look around and go, wait, what? There's no plan for me? Oh, wait, I'll just end up in the slum and I'll self-construct housing and I'll just basically squat here illegally in these squatter settlements and look for a better life and look for a job. So it's very, very important that you understand how these megacities are really plagued with the problems of slum development. We also should mention the global economy with the world cities, the 3 cities that have the most specialized quaternary and quinary control of the command and control of the global economy: New York City, London, and Tokyo. Okay, a couple of visuals to show you. This is what we mean by the growth of the megacities. Look at Paris barely hanging on. New York has fallen from the biggest city in the world to now barely hanging into the top 10. Look at the rise of the African cities. I talked about Lagos. I'm going to show you guys a quick video in school later this week or early next, where I'm going to show you the biggest megacity in the world that nobody has ever heard of, and that is Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. It has doubled its population in every decade since independence in the 1970s. Bangladesh, of course, used to be East Pakistan, and when it became independent of Pakistan, the population of Dhaka was not even 1 million. And by the 80s, it was 2, and by the 90s, it was 4, and by the 2000s, it was 8, and today it's in excess of 16, and as we go into the future, you could see Dhaka of almost 30 million people. And we'll talk about the stresses that Dhaka is under as it goes through that. Here's what we mean, again, megacities and metacities. This one does go so much smaller on this map, so you start to get even all the way down to, say, 1 million. Over 10 is your mega. 20 would be meta, so this kind of goes 15. But if you see concentrations in Asia, and certainly with megacities, we see a few in Africa, Latin America. Remember, Europe and the US, those large cities are decreasing in population, partly because of aging, but also partly because people are leaving cities and going into suburbs. Here's what I meant by the world cities. You've got Tokyo, you've got London, you've got New York, and also basically those are the 3 biggest stock market exchanges, the 3 biggest economic centers. The question, of course, becomes what happens with London due to Brexit. And if you'll forgive me, I'll just show you a couple quick pictures that drive this home, right? And so we're going to go back. We'll hit New York, right? We'll hit London, we'll hit Tokyo, what do we notice is the common denominator of all of these big important world cities, right? Tall buildings, right? Always the big giveaway that there's a big command and control of quaternary and quinary finance, insurance, real estate, and decision-making capability. All right, last but not least, Megalopolis. We've talked about this so much this year, so I won't spend a lot of time. Boston, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. Definitely we see a megapolitan cluster in that area. These cities are kind of growing into each other. There's only really one other place in the world that's like this, and that's Tokyo through Nagoya and into Osaka. In Japan, we did this. We rode the Shinkansen between Tokyo and Osaka, 1 hour to go 200 miles because of the high-speed bullet train. So cool. Make sure you know what a megalopolis is. We can see these in the United States, maybe the Chicagoland area, the area around Atlanta, the Texas Triangle between Dallas, Houston, and Austin, San Antonio, and back up to, say, Fort Worth. Certainly the California coastline between San Diego and Los Angeles, right? All of these are good examples of what we mean by these conurbations and megalopolis formations. Okay, sorry to go over 20. Hopefully you can make popcorn and be entertained for a little while. All right, we'll see you back in class. I'll try to have video 5 posted for you real soon.